So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited to have my guest today, Suzi Rutti. Suzi, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Suzi is a clinical social worker that works with children, adolescents, and adults of all ages, specializes in the treatment of complex PTSD, dissociation, dissociative disorders, preverbal trauma, sexual violence, and childhood abuse. Suzi owns and operates Rutti Counseling and Consultation, LLC, in Columbus, Ohio, and is a co-owner of the Ohio Institute for Trauma and Wellness. She's a faculty member with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness and provides EMDR therapy training and advanced EMDR therapy training in Central Ohio. Awesome. So obviously are you in Ohio now?
I am, yes. I'm in Columbus.
Okay. And where are you from originally?
I was born and raised in Lexington, Massachusetts, so
cool.
a suburb outside of Boston, and lived there through high school, and I've been in Columbus since graduate school, college, so about 20 years now.
Okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, that's with
Dr. Jamie Marich.
Dr. Jamie Marich, right? Of course. Yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's dive in here, Suzi. I'm always struck, I continue to be struck by people who are working in this field, by people who are working with kids and in trauma. How did you get involved in this field specialization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was trying to think back, and I would always seem to be interested in people, how people work, how the mind works. I have some pharmacists in my family. So when I was young, I kind of thought about that field, thought about medical field. But I took a psychology class in high school and just was really fascinated with all of it, every aspect of it, and went into college studying psychology.
Wow.
And then came across trauma in, really not into graduate school. And I didn't, we all say we didn't get enough of it in school, but in my field placements is where I saw it and was, really struck by it, and just started viewing everything through that lens. And
so interesting, if I may interject for a second. So you started off in high school taking class, and that kind of grabbed you. Went through college, and you said it wasn't even until graduate school that trauma which is really interesting. Very interesting.
There are other aspects of psychology that were interesting to me, but really where I fell into trauma was graduate school.
Okay. So take us through there. So you get into graduate school. What are you thinking at that time in terms of what you want to do and who you want to work with, if even that was on your
I don't know if it was part of who I was growing up. I was always interested in working with teens and young females, probably eating disorder type of stuff. And then I had a field placement working specifically with kids who had experienced trauma. And this was in Toledo, Ohio, called the Cullen Center up in Toledo, Ohio. And just started seeing symptoms in a really different way, things that I had maybe attributed to other diagnoses, because, symptoms cross over so many different diagnoses, and right. I'm not a big diagnoser, anyway, and I could go on a tangent about that, but I just started seeing people's behavior and symptoms as a result of their experiences, and it really shaped things in a different way for me.
You said you were working with kids. How old were these kids?
I don't have a minimum. So I see.
No, in that placement, in that field placement.
Yeah, that field placement, probably the youngest was 4, so 4 or 5.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And what symptoms were you seeing?
Lots of difficulties with school. Kids who were not being able to be maintained at school, or were having lots of acting out behaviors. Sometimes we would get the kids that were really just internalizing, having the anxiety and internalizing, but most kids would come to us because of behaviors, right? The parents or the teachers or somebody's noticing something that they don't like or they're concerned about. So oftentimes some of the other more internalized symptoms get overlooked.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as I've talked about before on this podcast, I worked with kids myself, not as young as 4, but kind of
Yeah.
12 and 25 range. And students, especially, there's a lot of that behavior, and
Mhm.
it's oftentimes can be explosive. And of course,
Yeah.
that's what people see, right? Talk a little bit about that, how you came to understand that, well, maybe this isn't just because he's having problems with the work or something,
Yeah.
how you
Yeah.
began to,
Well, I was lucky enough to have, the mentor that I had at the time in that field placement really did some quality education with me and in the community about trauma and the impact of trauma on kids. I think where it really hit me was my first job at a graduate school was in a partial hospitalization program with kids, and they all have trauma, right?
right.
Every single kid that came in there had experienced trauma. They weren't being able to be maintained in their classrooms. They were coming there specifically for treatment. Um, but they were all getting labels like ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, some of them even conduct disorder, and it wasn't sitting well with me.
Hmm.
Because that's that they were coming there for a reason, and so I really wanted to, and that's actually why I became so interested in EMDR therapy, is because I wanted something to actually address that, to address
Hmm.
the injury that these kids had experienced, and not just treat the symptoms.
So for our listeners who kind of span the variety of experience levels,
Sure.
talk a little more, Susie, if you could, about how trauma, and even talk about maybe some specific types or kinds of trauma, impacts and affects a kid at school.
Yeah, all different ways. I mean, like we talked about, a lot of what we talk about and people see and notice are the external behaviors. So the kids that um, can't sit still in their seats, or they're distractible, or they're, not doing well in school because their attention or their memory or their, whatever it is has been influenced. Brain development is influenced and impacted. So the ability to learn and remember and stay focused is all impacted as a
Hmm.
result of trauma affecting the brain. But there's other symptoms too that we don't always see or talk about, and those are the more internalized beliefs that kids have about themselves. Kids sitting in the classroom, a kid sitting in the classroom with the belief of, I'm not worthy, or I'm stupid, or I'm whatever, is going to have a much different experience than a kid who
Right.
is raised with, positive beliefs about themselves.
Hmm. How would you um, recommend for our listeners kind of even approaching this topic with a kid, right? I mean, there are teachers who listen, there are social workers, obviously, who listen to this podcast too, but trauma is not always the easiest thing to talk about, especially with a kid. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the way that we conceptualize working with kids is, we have to adapt it to their developmental levels, and it's important because not just their chronological age, but we have to adapt our approaches to how they are, developmentally, and oftentimes that's impacted by when they experience trauma. So some of our kids, a lot of the kids that I work with even experience, and my adults too, experience trauma before they had language. So
Hmm.
if they had trauma, at an age where they were preverbal, um, they may not be able to readily recognize that they've even experienced trauma, or have
Hmm.
words for it or names for it. So with kids, I am talking about, symptoms and impacts and what they want to be different. And then we start kind of identifying some themes in their lives and start tracing some things back, to where some of those themes might have started.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point about the preverbal trauma. It just reminds me of one of the things Bruce Perry talks about is, regulate, relate, then reason.
Yes.
I mean, a kid whose body is completely dysregulated obviously is going to have probably going to have a very difficult time absorbing information.
Absolutely.
Um, it's so crazy to me when I was working in this clinic and we were assessing kids who were showing early signs of early psychosis. There was a lot of trauma in that
Mhm.
population, and these kids just weren't able to keep it together at school. Most of them
Yeah.
weren't,
Yeah.
and it's it just brings me back to it was one of the reasons really why I started this podcast, because we were talking oftentimes to parents who didn't really recognize that this particular incident that their child had experienced was traumatic for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, so what happened after for you? What happened after graduate school? How did you talked a little bit about EMDR? How did things progress for you?
Yeah, so that field placement that I talked about that really was, I'd say a life changer for me. While I was there, they were just getting trained in EMDR therapy, the clinicians there, so I had a kind of a taste of it there. And then, had another year of graduate school, and did some research on it. And then in that first actual real job after graduate school that I had, again, I was feeling really stuck.
Mm,
With something that could help get to the root of these kids' experiences. I was using some other modalities and doing some good, I think, education and helping them understand things that were going on, but I was just getting stuck at the processing part.
mhm.
So I really advocated to get myself and some other staff trained in EMDR therapy, and it kind of just blew off from there.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
talk more about that. What changed? How did it change? What did it look like for you?
Yeah, so with that population in particular, I had to I was able to do a lot of preparation work with those kids because they were just living in crisis. They were in partial hospitalization. So a lot of what we were doing was stabilization, like you were talking about, just getting them to a level where they can learn and function
Mhm.
and relate, to other people, getting them back in their window of tolerance. But for some of my kids, and even in the short period of time that I had there, I was able to do some trauma reprocessing with them using EMDR therapy, and it just shifted things in a way
Mhm.
that I hadn't seen before. And as I got, my job after that was in, more of an outpatient focus, where I had people coming in were a little more regulated, from the beginning. So I was able to do a lot of, complete EMDR therapy sessions and treatment with people, and it was changing people. It still is changing people's lives, and even people who'd been in therapy for a long time were just seeing
Mhm.
these changes they hadn't felt were possible.
So give us, if you can, an example of where EMDR might work. And for example, when would it not be the best modality? In what kind of situation?
Sure. So my answer would be everybody can do EMDR therapy. And the reason for that is because it's an 8-phase protocol. And so a lot of people think of kind of the EMDR that was originally established, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, was initially, resembled somewhat of a technique, or, something that
Hmm.
we just use to oftentimes to process single incident traumas. But we've really shifted, and especially Dr. Jamie Marriage's program, the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, really emphasizes the earlier phases of the treatment, so that we're adequately preparing people, helping them learn strategies to get in their window of tolerance, lots of mindfulness strategies to help keep them here.
Hmm.
Even for clients who have dissociation or addictions, everybody can benefit from early phases
Hmm.
of EMDR therapy. And then the question becomes, when are people ready to do the reprocessing piece that's going to vary, depending on
Hmm.
where clients are with their level of functioning.
So the preparation period or part you're talking about um, is a time where you help the client resource, learn the grounding, et cetera, et cetera. And that is to get them ready for what specifically?
Basically, to be able to tolerate the stuff that's going to come up when we move into
Okay.
processing their past experiences. So if we jump in
Okay.
too soon, they're going to become dysregulated.
Right.
But if we teach them the strategies, not just to, the calming stuff and the mindfulness that people think of, just this meditation kind of stuff, but also teaching them and helping them explore distress tolerance, so that when their body starts to experience things that are uncomfortable, we can help their brain know that stuff isn't actually still happening. Um,
Hmm.
so it's a lot of different types of preparation to get them ready for when we actually bring up the stuff that we need to process.
Right. Right. And what was it like for you as a human being working with, as you started to work more and more with trauma.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that kind of brings us into why I'm so passionate about secondary trauma, right? Is because I fell into trauma and there wasn't any going back for me. It's my worldview now. The lens that I look through is trauma. But that wasn't always helpful at times, right? When we're trying to live our lives and not be in the therapy office, that can take a toll on us too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important that we and I learned along the way, ways that I wasn't taking the best care of myself, or ways, certain cases that I was having a harder time leaving at work,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. And it helped me see that I needed to have some strategies in place to continue to do the work, to survive the work, right?
Can you share that with us? One of those examples with us?
Examples of things that I do or ways that I needed it.
Well, a period where you were like, oh man, I need to start, developing some boundaries and taking better care of myself, because clinicians, or especially people who are just starting to get into this field,
Yeah.
really can benefit from that type of insight.
Yeah. So what I've noticed in the work that I've done, I've never not liked the work I was doing. When I was in the office with my clients, I always felt fulfillment from that. But I found what a lot of the impact of how well I was tolerating it and surviving it was all the other stuff that was happening at work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it was toxic work environments. Sometimes it was my own boundaries slipping a little bit, in terms of my biggest weakness is always scheduling too much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a chronic overworker. So if I was working, sometimes my colleagues would look at the schedule and be like, what are you doing? Just client after client after client, long days. There was a period of time I was working multiple jobs. And that was taking a toll. And I, was recognizing that I couldn't do the best work and keep doing this work if I wasn't putting some things in place.
So you talked about secondary trauma. How did that
Yeah.
impact you? How's it impacted
Yeah.
you?
In a variety of ways, I've been influenced, by Charles Figley's work, and of course trauma stewardship, and different people have different definitions of secondary trauma, but I like to pull from all of them because they're all relevant. Um, but I think the thing that I've seen in myself and a lot of the clinicians that I work with, I work with clinicians in a variety of ways. I work with them in training. I supervise them. I have a staff of clinicians. I also provide consultation, but I see them as clients too. So I've seen
Mm-hmm.
the impact of secondary trauma across, all different facets of our lives. Um, Exhaustion is one of them. Exhaustion that I see just such a trend and theme with clinicians that are just oftentimes, again, working long hours,
Right.
especially clinicians in private practice that are, just trying to live off their own income, or also agency clinicians that have high productivity expectations. So the exhaustion, the view of the world, I think, has been an impact. I noticed it personally myself, especially when I had my own child. So I think,
What do you mean
you
the view of the world?
in terms of safety, I think, in terms of what's safe out there, who's
Mm,
safe. We see the worst of what can happen, right? And we see it
right.
happening to people just like us. And so it can make things, if we're not having a good balance, it can make it feel like that's everywhere and
Right.
inevitable almost.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's pretty intense to be working in this field and to be on a daily basis
Yeah.
sitting across from people who've experienced
Yeah.
awful
Yeah.
stuff. I mean, it cannot. And in fact, I think it was Charles Figley, who I interviewed on this podcast, who said, I mean, you, by the very fact nature of you being a human, you cannot help but be impacted by this. And if you're not, something's going on. I mean, you have it's, you have to be, but therein lies the art and the experience where you've got to develop a way and a method of taking care of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I get asked that question. We tend to be the people at the party that when people ask you what you do, it's like, oh, you feel the mood shift,
Right.
or how do you do that, or oh, you must be such a great person. But it's we all care about people. Everybody that goes into this field cares about people, but we also have to have a balance. Otherwise, we can't keep doing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Talk about, if you can, Suzi, kind of an early clinical error and how what you learned from that.
Yeah, I tried to think about this, and I was trying to think about specific clients. I think more of a theme of when it comes to secondary
Suzi, I need specifics.
specifics. Okay, I can think of a couple clients in
Okay.
particular, clinicians as clients. So clinicians that were coming to me for treatment, and working in the field. A couple of them I can think of in particular working in community mental health field, so kind of in the trenches of,
Mm,
and early in their career too. So, shortly after graduate school, first job, I can think of two clients in particular, who were getting just flooded with their own trauma histories. And I think, I was conceptualizing it with their past trauma, and that's what, we did a lot of work around their past trauma, and I don't think I would all the way change that. But I think I was overlooking the impact of the stories that they were hearing, and the types
mm,
of clients that they were looking at in terms of the secondary trauma. I
mm-hmm,
recognized that it was triggering their past stuff, but I think I overlooked and didn't pay enough attention to the impact of the work they were doing day to day, and the impact of the administrative work, and even just the politics of the agencies and different things
mm-hmm.
that make people feel stuck and powerless. I think if I could go back, I would look at it with a little broader scope.
So what do you think you would have done or would do differently? I mean, more
Yeah,
specifically.
I think I would be looking, when we work specifically with EMDR therapy, we're looking at negative cognitions, beliefs about ourselves that we've developed. And I would ask more specifically about the beliefs that they hold about themselves now when they think about doing the work with those clients. The
Mm-hmm.
clients that they felt helpless about, or the clients that they were, one client in particular that was just really getting hit really hard, personally, by the stories that she was hearing. That was honestly making me question her, whether she should stay in the field or could stay in the field. And we did do work on her past trauma, but I would want to, make sure that we'd done more on her ability to tolerate the stuff that was coming up at work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's talk about, and it seems like just from reading your bio, you're pretty busy. Like you
Yeah,
said, alluded to, you're wearing a lot of hats.
I am.
So you have your own private practice. You have people who are working for you.
Yes.
What's your role? Talk about your role in with Institute for Creative Mindfulness.
Yeah, so I'm a senior faculty member at the Institute for Creative Mindfulness with Dr. Jamie Marich. So I teach the foundational EMDR therapy trainings, and then I have some special topics courses that I teach as well.
Okay. Okay. And EMDR is obviously it's all over the place. It's constantly mentioned. Would you recommend that for, I mean, people who are listening to this, who there's there's so many, right, resources out there, different modalities, workshops to take,
Yeah.
for those people who are like, I want to get into this field. I don't know whether to do this or that. What would you recommend to them? And obviously, I know this is hard and people are different, but
Yeah. Yeah, I can't recommend EMDR therapy enough. Not just for clinicians to become trained in it, but I encourage everybody to experience their own. If somebody's really questioning, is this going to be something that's right for me? Try it. Find an
mm-hmm,
EMDR therapist in your area. We have to practice in the training, but we also recognize that it's an expensive training and it takes a lot of hours. of training and consultation. And so, people want to be sure that it's something they want to do before they get into it. But I don't know that I can think of anybody that's gone through at least the trainings that I've been in and taught,
Mm-hmm.
or consulted, where somebody has thought, no, this isn't for me.
Right.
Oftentimes after just a few days of training, people are, talking about how it's changing their practice and changing,
Wow.
their outlook. And, it's changed my life. And so I can't recommend it enough.
That's awesome. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Suzanne Rutti. Her website is SuzanneRutti.com. That's SuzanneRutti.com. And is that the best place for people to contact you?
Yeah, that's a good place to contact me. They
Okay.
can send an inquiry through email. There's a link on the website.
Okay. And as far as resources you provide, obviously you're providing therapy, but you mentioned you're doing consultation.
Yes.
Okay. What else? Talk
Yeah,
about.
so I do consultation for clinicians, mostly EMDR consultation, but other consultation as well.
Is
And
that
then I do
online as well as in person?
in person and on the phone and
Okay.
video. Yeah.
Okay.
And I offer secondary trauma consultation for people who are looking to get programs set up at their agencies or offices.
And talk a little bit more about that. What is that specifically?
Yeah, so I've developed a group format for secondary trauma, for community professionals who are impacted by secondary trauma and burnout.
Wow.
So I offer it actually at my office quarterly, but I also am available to help people set up self-sustainable groups at their practices or agencies.
That's really cool. That's the first time I think I've heard of that.
Yeah. So it's there was a task force here in Columbus many years ago that looked at this group format, and I've kind of built off of that from then. But it's the format is, the first part of it is, we address a topic, and I've divided it into kind of 4 key concepts of secondary trauma. So we pick a topic and process that topic, but then the second half of the group is just a process. It's an open processing group for people to just talk about what's going on, which
these
has
are the
been
therapists.
really helpful for people. Yeah, mostly
Okay.
therapists. Sometimes other professionals, like I've had some advocates or
Right,
other
right.
people who work directly with trauma. But it's a great space if they come here for people that don't have access to that at their programs, or we can help them set one up at their organization.
Awesome. All right, Suzi, how about a go-to book recommendation?
I have to go with trauma stewardship.
Okay.
So it's I think it's a great educational piece about what secondary trauma looks like, but it also provides some applicable tips for how to deal with it.
And that is by Laura Vanderlipsky. Second time that book has been recommended in the past week.
Really? Yeah.
Awesome. Well, man, you are doing amazing work. I mean, you're so busy. You've got your fingers in all these different aspects of it, and it's inspiring, man. And I love talking to people like you who are really doing this work. It's incredible to help people out there who've been impacted with trauma. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
All right, Suzi, take care.
Thanks, you too.